Still haven't figured out how to do all of this stuff in a car, but let me try. So I just finished listening to a podcast that author of AlpineJS did, where he talks about HTMX, and he's like, "Oh, it's like hype cycles, everything is up and down," which is true, and like people kind of like having those service level discussions without going kind of like too deep, and then he proceeds and gives his surface level kind of like understanding of the security issues in HTMX, which was like I don't know, like a bit ironic. Yeah, so in like last 2 minutes, he talks about like CSP and like is HTMX kind of like insecure, and he points out that like AlpineJS is more insecure because you can't use Alpine if you have uh, CSP content security policy or whatever. I never actually used that, so my understanding is again like surface level. But this is like a one common thing that you do to secure your website by like disabling evals and all that stuff. And AlpineJS can only work if you have eval enabled. And HTMX, by the way, can work without. I mean, yeah, it can work even if you have CSP because they don't rely on eval. I think they do for some of the features. I don't remember. I think it's like filtering events or something like that because you're writing a string to that is like executable that has like JavaScript code logic to filter events. So I think that's probably like the feature that's not going to work. That is like the closest to kind of like how Alpine works, right? So it's not going to work. But otherwise, it's kind of like pretty secure. So there are like two levels of talking about security in HTMX. So one is it's not insecure, it just feels less secure. It's basically kind of like question of separation of concerns. If I'm sending my user as a JSON object that has a first name and last name, and I'm inserting it into HTML using React, there is no way for this data to kind of like to escalate in any way, like to become executable, because it's like, yeah, it's just a string. You put a name here, you put last name here. And if you're sending your full name as a piece of HTML, right, which is like, I don't know, like two divs or whatever, like it's already kind of like executable HTML. It could be pretty safe HTML still, but it's just like escalated. So if you're using kind of like all the modern frameworks, if you're not doing like PHP echo first name, which is kind of like you need to escape it right manually, but in all the modern frameworks, uh, everything kind of like is already escaped. So it's as safe to use. It's as safe to generate that username on backend as it is like on the front end. Like it doesn't matter if you use React on like on backend to generate that or any other modern framework to generate that. So I think that point is a bit it's kind of like it feels wrong, but there's like no real consequences of that. Um, I mean, there is a bit more chance of like doing something wrong. So like imagine if in React you just like went on the wrong API and got, I don't know, like a user JSON from like third party domain. I don't know if your course works, but like you got some data wrong and you like displayed it and it's like, yeah, it's just like wrong data. There's like no security concerns. But if you're sending like HTML over the wire, something gone wrong and you're requesting it from different domain or something like that, it's like it's slightly less potentially secure, but like not in practical sense. What in practical sense is insecure, and I try to kind of like I tried to create a demo for that and to show what exactly is like for real insecure about HTMX is that in HTMX every content that you get from like your HTMX request is like executable because you're getting HTML that has some logic in it. This is just like the HTOS, where I forgot the like the acronym, but that's just like the way that they think about how to build an application. And for that thing, it's um, it's basically like important that that if you're sending a button over the wire, you can click on that button, right? If you're sending a form, you can submit that form. So it's like it's important for it to be executable, but then it's like how do you make sure that you can send something that is not executable? And in HTMX, you mark it with hx disable attribute, set an attribute and an element. So like everything inside of that element becomes kind of like inert, right? It now it's even though it's an HTML, so this you still have like the same kind of like security concerns in terms of HTML. So your HTML have to be sanitized and all that stuff, but that's kind of like all taken care of usually nowadays. But the problem is that you're showing like a blog post or something like that, right? And it's like it's stored in Markdown. Maybe you're getting it from CMS and all that stuff. And it's like, okay, it's not technically safe to just like get data from CMS and just like show it on your page because like who knows if someone can, I don't know, like send a comment or something. I don't know. Like again, it's like just like elevating a bit like the security concerns, but it could not be, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's insecure, but it is still a case where imagine you're rendering markdown. I don't know, you're like a GitHub, right? And you allow everyone to edit like a README page or like gist or something like that. And like this is like you will not want your markdown to do like anything executable. It's like it's user input, it should be inert. If you're doing some kind of like markdown to HTML thing, and if that thing is not aware that attributes are executable, which like most of them by default do that, so they will strip all the attributes and all that stuff. So it's like it's general default that you won't get this issue, but someone who could be like working on it and they're like, oh, but I need like this data attribute to show, I don't know, something like date in some format. They're like, who cares? It's like they're like, oh, I want to preserve data attributes, and you just like if you don't know that this is a thing in HTMX attributes are executable, your like parser or sanitizer or whatever, they could be producing HTMX attributes, and you can, if we're talking about GitHub, right, you can create a README that has like executable button on it. Like you can't do that on GitHub, but if GitHub was using HTMX, uh, and if GitHub didn't set the HX disable attribute, and if the parser that GitLab has or GitHub, it doesn't matter, they have it allows you to send your data attributes or like whatever like custom attributes. So like if all of those five things happened, HTMX is less secure than React. But yeah, I don't know. It seems a bit of a stretch, and this explanation is like, yeah, just explain users that this could happen and explain them that they should use this attribute. But yeah, there's no nuance like that on Twitter, so I understand why like it's hard to do that. And yeah, that's probably the whole security argument. So HTMX is more secure than Alpine in terms of like CSP policies and all that stuff. if you're using modern backend framework with HTMX, by default it's pretty secure. The only thing that you need to be thinking about is that if you have user input generating HTML, you have to make sure that you're adding this attribute to make that kind of like HTML node, right, inert, so that HTMX doesn't run it. It's the same concern in Alpine as far as I understand, because it's like it's also like attributes are executable there. So I'm surprised that he didn't know about the like executable attributes, and this is like the only kind of like consideration, real security consideration. But yeah, otherwise, I like that podcast. I had a very similar video recently uh, about HTMX, and the idea is like, yeah, it's cool that people who are like only seen React their whole life, they can finally see some other approaches, and they might understand how to like use servers better, and they they will benefit from that, at least in like in React or components terms, or something like that. But it might also be like a cool way of like, oh, this is easier to do like in React, this is easier to do in HTMX, or this is safer to do in React, or this is safer to do in HTMX. And I see that as a as a positive thing. And I would argue that it's like, did HTMX like win the internet by like all of these memes? Yeah, like not really. Like not everyone is on Twitter. Not everyone on Twitter like even knows what HTMX is, right? But they got some exposure. I saw like few people like, oh, what if we created HTMX with lit? Or what if we created like HTMX with like Preact or something? Yeah, I think that's a cool thing. If anything, that's cool because it's like it's live view light, all right? So like Phoenix kind of like introduced, I mean like reintroduced, right? Reintroduced this idea of like live view where you code everything on the back end, and uh, you just make a kind of client side JavaScript kind of like a dumb runner. So it's like you don't write a lot of JavaScript yourself. You have kind of like all the primitives to do to handle interactions on the server, or you have some kind of like components or like libraries that kind of like do enough of client side interactions, which is like the ideology is kind of like old, right? It's like that's how like jQuery plugins and all that stuff worked. But um, if anything, like if more people who would hear about HTMX will like look into like a live view or something like that, and they will like, oh, I wonder how they do like this. Oh, they do it like that. Oh, I wonder how they do this, or they do it like that. So like more people will be interested in uh, just like using servers more, or maybe like something like Astro, all that stuff. So that's basically the same thing that I said. But I think he went a bit like doom and gloom with like, oh, like they put this thing on the pedestal. How do we say it? I don't know, something like that. They put it like high, and now like it's going to drop pretty low. I think it wasn't that high, and I think it's not dropping low, because like the actual security concerns are kind of like pretty well covered. And yeah, yeah, it's fun to see. I'm having fun just like looking at whatever is happening.